Welcome to this episode of Talking Inspiration with Herb Kim, who has had a major impact on the Northeast digital and creative sector. He runs events such as Thinking Digital and TEDx Newcastle, along with many other events as well. So, tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, as you mentioned, I'm not from the Northeast originally. I came, first to the UK in 1997, and then up to the Northeast in 2002. And I was brought up here by the old regional development agency, One Northeast, and with the mission of trying to grow the digital creative sector of Northeast England. And I've been doing it in one capacity or another since 2002. So 23 years now, I guess. So it's been a while.
Yeah. To be a dab hand at it. I've certainly been to the Thinking Digital conference, and it's absolutely amazing. It sort of brings people, to the area, many of whom may never have even been here, but it also is a great way of sort of celebrating what's going on here as well, and bringing, guests that are well known to the area and just getting them to experience the Northeast. That's been a really great thing to see.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's been a joy to be a part of it for sure.
Excellent. Yeah. Brilliant.
Yeah.
So for inspiration, there's probably something that means something to you. So have you got something with you that sort of inspires you?
Sure. Yes. Got it right down here, and it is maybe what you would expect. This is a MacBook Air, the M1 version, and the reason I brought it is because I kind of got turned on to, I got my dad to buy the original IBM PC in 1980. So I should note I'm 57 years old.
Wow.
So I've been around for a while, just generally old enough to have, I wouldn't say bullied, but say persuaded my father to make the hefty investment in a very, rudimentary personal computer back in 1980. And, to me, this is obviously the sort of on the other side of that journey. And I think what it was about personal technology was this idea. I think that Steve Jobs, a quotation from Steve Jobs about computing being bicycles from the mind, right? Yeah. And this very kind of hippie notion that this technology could help people make their world and our world better. And obviously these days, technology has not necessarily always achieved betterment for society, but this reminds me of where it came from, and hopefully where it could return to.
So when you say return to, what do you mean by that? So what's your thought there?
Well, I think it's an interesting observation, because if you look at something as fundamental as the personal computer, right, obviously it has unleashed a ton of productivity and value for individuals, organizations, countries, so on and so forth, right? The interesting thing is that you'd struggle to find anyone who really made a ton of money on them, right? Yeah. There's no company. You can't think, you'd struggle. You might say Dell or, but there's no obvious dominating piece. So it means that most of the value of this machine has actually gone to people and organizations and companies, right? It's been, in a sense, a democratized piece of technology, right? And so when social media started popping up, between YouTube and Twitter and all these other things, there was this sense, and of course they were all free, right? And there was this early sense of how these tools are going to help bring humanity closer together, right? And this sort of utopian sense of sharing and connecting across borders, across race, across political lines, so on and so forth. And exactly the opposite has happened, right? We have a couple of phenomena. You have a few individuals who have collected almost all the value, the commercial value from these things. Concentrating that for what appears to be mostly bad results at a social level. And they have achieved that by dividing us, right? Because ultimately, people warring over race, sex, technology, whatever it might be, generates revenue. Happy, peaceful agreement where no one says much does not. And so all the incentives have been towards inciting, maybe not all the incentives, but many of the incentives. And as we can see, as whether you look at an international level or a national level or at a community level, where you don't have to go to the United Nations to find division, right? You can literally walk down the street and my family, half of my family's still in America, and so I'm there, and they happen to live in North Carolina, which is famously one of these so-called swing states.
Yeah.
And we've been there since 1990. So again, with 30 plus years, and you can always track the kind of sense of division between just regular people. Just going to the store now is a bit of a minefield to make sure. Oh, you have to be careful of both not possibly being interpreted as racist or possibly inflaming a MAGA voter.
Yeah.
And so, and it's just a bizarre overhead to have in supposedly the world's richest, most powerful and advanced country.
Yeah.
That actually the quality of life for the regular person has got worse. Now, can you put it all on the feed of social media? No, but you can put a lot of it there. That's certainly one thing that's different from, say, 1990 to today. So that's kind of why, to me, looking back on this laptop is almost a look back to where we came from.
Yeah.
And I would imagine, people who have been on company journeys, who might have been part of a startup company, and they remember the heady days of how exciting it was, and then, God forbid, the company actually becomes successful, and then so many people jettison out, because they're like, it's not the same place it was anymore, and it's lost its kind of, if you will, hippie soul of what we were trying to do. Of course, we wanted to make money, but we were also trying to achieve something else beyond merely making money. And unfortunately, generally speaking, if you create something successful, typically speaking, the money people take over and milk it for as much as they possibly can. And oftentimes kill the thing. I mean, Twitter probably a good example of that. I mean, it's not dead yet, but it appears to be on its way towards death. Tesla, which we were talking about before, appears it certainly lost a ton of value, and you can't really see an easy path back other than someone buying, a kind of the remains of Tesla and building it back up to the vision it originally had, sort of thing. And who knows, maybe we'll be looking at a Model 3, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. So I remember the promise of this once great company. So, and I mean, not to go too far afield, but I mean, a positive that might come out of it is obviously we're on the brink, supposedly, of the AI era. And at least we're entering this era with as much cynicism and skepticism of particularly corporate power and a lack of government oversight as we enter this space, versus thinking, oh, we just leave it up to Elon and Mark Zuckerberg, and they'll just magically sort it all out for us.
I think the thing with AI is, I think the irony is, people have kind of seen all the sort of impossible consequences of AI going wrong. They've seen all these sci-fi depictions of AI. So everyone already kind of has a reservation about it. They want to kind of use the best out of it. They want to make sure that AI is, rather than reflecting what society is actually like in its bad ways, but actually focusing on the idealistic ways, almost make the AI behave in a way that we wish we were, and sort of bring people together. It feels like AI might be the technology that can sort of even things out, but obviously it tends to reflect a lot of the unevenness as well, those divisions. So it's kind of the hope that because there's not that regulation, because that's the kind of the potential of that technology, it might have the ability to kind of sort of bring things a bit better, maybe focus things a bit more, and maybe highlight a lot of these differences and maybe eliminate many of them as well.
One can only hope that
that's the optimistic way.
Yes, and perhaps the social media era has been a warning to us all that it's not all necessarily all going to work out in the end. It doesn't. The so-called free market, it doesn't always end up with pro-social endings.
When you were talking about bringing this object which is a Mac, you talked about the original PC you had, an IBM. So what was the transition point from basically the sort of PC Microsoft world to the Apple world?
For me, it was relatively recently. So I've been a Windows person since at least 2010, maybe, or some thereabouts, if you will. So I mean, I guess it's been going on to 15 years now about making the switch. But and it basically came down to people, I guess more and more people as I've gotten involved in these conferences,
Yeah.
a lot of the technology early adopters, and especially when we started the old Dibby Design and Build It conference, which obviously was half designers and half developers. Typically speaking, most of the designers had Macs, and so
Yeah.
I thought, okay, well, let me check out what the cool kids are computing on, and I thought I'd give it a try, and it wasn't like, oh my God, this is the thing that's going to save my life, but it was just that little bit better and easier. And
Yeah.
then once you get fully adapted to all the shortcuts and all that sort of stuff, you're just like, well, I don't really have any reason to leave. I do think specifically to this machine, when they finally got off the Intel based chips to their own Apple Silicon, it was a great leap forward for them, and I
Yeah.
think for the category in general. And so that's why if I had to go back onto Windows tomorrow, I'd have no issue. I wouldn't kick or
Okay.
scream
Yeah.
about it, sort of thing. That's not a ideological thing. If
So you're not turned your
know.
back on Microsoft or the PC sort of
No,
system.
I think most people agree. Microsoft in the Satya Nadella era has changed, and it
Yeah.
has opened, and it has sought to have a bigger perspective than just Microsoft versus the world.
Yeah.
And he to some extent, perhaps you could say has a bit of that hippie vibe I was talking about
Yeah.
before. Whereas with Steve Ballmer, he was very traditional, hard charging
Yes.
capitalist. I need to win and crush everyone else.
I remember I was at an event in London many years ago, and Steve Ballmer was there, and he was speaking, and I had a chance to ask a question about some old device they had at the time, and whether it was going to be released in the UK, because there wasn't really any kind of sign of that. And I just straightforward asked him, and he basically just said no. I was like, I didn't expect him to answer. I thought he'd probably just have this kind of CEO roundabout answer. He just said no. And I was like, oh. And that was the first time they'd actually admitted to this at that time. This was for their Zune device, which was like a music player. And I was like, oh, but just his whole thing, his whole vibe is totally different to Satya, who's the current CEO. So it's kind of like the friendly neighborhood Microsoft these days. But it's interesting that it's not like an anti-Microsoft thing at all. It's just you went to that particular platform, and it suits you quite well,
just to try it. I mean, more or less around the same time. Weirdly, I was originally on the old iPhone 3G, and then I actually got given at a Google event, one of the early Android phones. I forget the name of it now, and I used that for years. I was actually on Android for years. I was on some of the old Samsung Galaxy phones, and then randomly around, I guess maybe around the time of the Apple 6, I said, oh well, we'll switch back just to see what the hype's all about, and just see if it is actually any better, sort of thing. And then it's fine. But if tomorrow again, I speaking of Steve Ballmer, I'm told that now he's obviously left Microsoft.
Yeah.
And he's now owns the LA Clippers.
Yeah.
And I'm told that any Clippers employee is not allowed to use an iPhone. So that's how deep.
So he's still well into that.
He still blames, rightfully so, because as you know, he famously made fun of the iPhone as a ridiculous sort of child's or a toy, but priced at $600 or whatever it was at the time, and that it would never catch on.
Yes.
And it more or less ended his career as they struggle to ever make Windows Phone.
Yes, exactly.
Relevant, so. Yeah, it's been an interesting time, but yeah, no, there's nothing about it. I mean, the other thing I would add about, Apple is and this device and going back to the original era of Apple. There's a well-known Silicon Valley venture capitalist, Roger McNamee, who was one of the earliest investors in Facebook.
Yeah,
also made a ton of money off that investment, not surprisingly, but then very famously turned publicly against Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, and was attacking their practices, or around privacy and other things that people had concerned. Actually, wrote a book called Zucked.
Wow.
About it, and about his issues with how they were conducting themselves. And what he talks about was about how Steve Jobs and Apple and that whole generation of industrialists, I guess you might call, had embedded in their DNA about this, what he called, this hippie version of Silicon Valley. This idea that computers and technology could be bicycles for the mind, and they could uplift people and society and companies and so on, so in a very positive way. And conveniently, I guess to some extent, timed with with his passing, that a very different, and you might argue darker, or maybe more mercenary philosophies, what he called the Peter Thiel version of Silicon Valley, began to take hold, which was much more libertarian, much more, say, friendly to the readings of an Ayn Rand. This idea that actually, to some extent, we're all in it for ourselves, and we should be shameless about the fact that we're in it to make ourselves as wealthy as possible, as powerful as possible, and yes, at the cost of others, is part of the game. We should not be shamed of saying, yes, some will suffer as we accumulate that power, but that's their own fault. If they were any smarter, they would have known better than to fall prey to whatever business model or piece of technology that we deploy. One of the things that I think, for better or for worse, that Steve Jobs and Apple did was they really actually democratized technology. So you'll remember an era in companies where the CEO and the CFO and whoever else just talked to the IT director, the CIO, whoever it was, and just more or less just said, you deal with that technology stuff, right? Oftentimes, they might have had the most expensive laptop or computer in the company, but oftentimes never used it. Had their secretary print out emails so they could read it on the plane, train, or whatever it might be, right? And the iPhone actually helped burst that barrier, where now the CFO was pressuring the CTO saying, I want my iPhone to read company email. Make it happen, right? And now suddenly the CTO is getting the call from upstairs. It used to be from all the employees saying, why the hell are we stuck with this technology that's so, all these ridiculous security barriers. And so, and I think, and the other thing it did is that, so for people on Wall Street and then in the finance world, right, they were also actually, generally speaking, not very friendly to technology, right? They had their old ways of doing business that they were very happy with, because generally speaking, they made them extremely wealthy, right? And so now what you see is, and then also the other thing as well is that as these companies start to get wealthier, so you imagine coming out of Harvard or Oxford or whatever sort of place, and your choice is put on a suit, get up at 6 a.m. every day, and then, go down to the finance camps, at Goldman Sachs or whatever, and suffer till midnight, or I could go work for this company called Google, right? And they're paying me the same money for whatever reason, but I get my lunch paid for. I show up kind of when I want to, right? I dress more or less how I want to, sort of thing. And, and so you saw this interesting culture where and the thing about that is you start to bring in basically a lot of traditional money people. As you know, there's a class of people that just care about how do I get rich, right? And so it used to be typically finance, banking, that sort of thing, right? But now they're saying, oh, I could do the same thing, but wake up at noon, but I can do it in Silicon Valley, right? And so I think you start to see an ethos of, if you will, normies coming in, and they were perfectly happy to say, oh yeah, that Peter Thiel stuff, that philosophy of just like, get rich quick, however you have to, and all this other stuff about, oh yeah, we're here to help change the world. Yeah, we'll say that in marketing, but whatever means that we can concentrate as much, income and wealth as quickly as possible, that's what we're actually going to do. Right. And that's exactly what happened, actually. So I don't know. That feels currently like where we're at in this kind of quasi dystopia, where we are at a macro level richer, more advanced. Sometimes if you look at the top line numbers, you say, well, why is anyone happy? This is a nirvana. But yet on the ground, and you don't have to go on the ground if you're beneath the 0.01%, certainly 0.1%. It doesn't feel very good, right? I mean, it's remarkably unsatisfying, and it's not just money, because even those who I've got retired people now at my age who are retired from their careers in banking and law and things like that, and they're like, so it's great that I achieved this thing, but I live in a country now where I actively fear is I have to sell my Tesla,
Yeah.
my beloved car, because I don't want to stress out every time I go to the restaurant or
Yeah.
leave it overnight at a hotel that it's going to get keyed, it's going to get tires punctured, or worse, set on fire in some cases, right? And so it's a weird place that we live in, where on in some levels it's never ever been better, and yet somehow or another, at a wide level, we feel less satisfied than certainly within our lifetime. Obviously, historically, I'm sure there have been wider, deeper depths of depression and whatnot. But it's a weird place to be.
Is there any way back, do you think, to kind of, ease those divisions or turn that around, make things like that marketing message rather than the sort of go for the money? Is there any way back? What's the hope there?
I think the greatest hope is that increasing an increasing number of normies, right? People who just wanted to be left alone in their nice house with their car, with their 2.5 kids or whatever.
Yeah.
To just, okay, there's all, they're increasingly worried, either because literally their jobs are being eliminated, or they just are just really stressed out about what's happening. And I think in America, I think if there's any positive come out of the last election, is that people realize that the Democrats, these establishment Democrats, are actually hopeless, right? I mean, who gives someone $1 billion in 3 months' time to win an election? Everyone says money is where you win this thing, right? And it outraised Trump by a factor of 3, right? And still lose. They lost bigger. We had a candidate who is half black, half Indian, and lost ground with blacks and Hispanics to Donald Trump, arguably seemingly, who's called racist and misogynist seemingly every other sentence. And yet, so, and I think ultimately it's because, people realize that the Democrats for a long time now have really been a party of the rich.
Yeah.
Most of them are multimillionaires themselves, right? And so what you get is kind of like they are disconnected from normal people, and they don't really want to reconnect because they don't want to change things like, say, taxes or other policies that might actually make it better for people making less than 100,000 pounds a year, sort of thing. And so all they seek to do is say, we're not the bad orange guy over there. And that's literally been Hillary Clinton's campaign is, I'm not Trump. And Kamala's campaign was, I'm not Trump. Oh, also, he's a fascist.
Yeah.
That's how they up the ante, by adding even more swear words or derogatory terms. And you need to, people aren't dumb, right? Because if you have been a Democrat all these years, you have been waiting for that change, right? Income and wealth distribution has got worse since World War II.
Yeah.
So you're talking, what are we, 70 years of steady worsening of, and so, and everyone comes in, it's going to be better, all this sort of stuff. And then they come and they go. And Obama, who was probably the last, widely embraced Democratic president, it got worse under him as well. How do you have a financial crisis that attacks the price of stock price assets and house assets, and the rich get richer? Because those are the people who actually own those things. And yet, despite that crash, they actually got richer during this period. Right?
Yeah.
So, anyway, so I think my great hope is that also that people realize we need to actually it's no longer good enough to just sit here outraged all the time about, oh, have you read about what Trump's doing? Oh, have you read? Of course, we're going to do that to some extent, but that's not enough. We've actually got to say, well, okay, so what are we going to offer that's different other than we're not them?
Yeah.
And so my hope is that there's still change possible within the system and institutions we have, because I don't know where this goes. Now, we could spend all podcasts talking about craziness. There, a lot of people are talking about that part of this is effectively a pretext for Trump to be able to take over institutions in a martial law sort of way, right? To ensure that he can stay in power beyond 2028. But we won't go there because we'll need at least multiple episodes to explore that. But I think there are realistic ways to get it. I just think people need to, they actually need to pressure the people who they consider their allies
Yeah.
to up their game and get better. We now know, yes, there is a bad orange man out there.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we'll see.
Yeah. It's not enough to say what you're not going to do. You have to say what you are going to do instead, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And, it does mean that, one of the arguments I make is that, we suffer a global leadership crisis, right? Because if you think about, so we talk interchangeably about leaders and managers, like senior leaders, were they a leader or are they a manager, right?
Yeah.
And there's, in my opinion, a big difference, right? Because for me, a leader has, holds the vision and message and to some extent, the overall direction of where we want to go. And it's typically a more emotive sort of message, like, I don't know, for anyone making less than £1 million a year, I'm for you, or whatever number you want to put, and the thing about it is that our opposition, if you will, whether it be labor here, the Democrats in the U.S., or obviously the equivalent in other countries, is that they don't seem to know what leadership is anymore. Whereas the bad guys, in this instance, they're great at it. Make America great again, which is one of the greatest, most powerful political phrases.
Yeah, it's a simple message, isn't it?
It's a simple message. I mean, Boris had as well. Get Brexit done. Say the famous red bus. 350 million a week to the NHS. Take back control. All these simple, easy to understand. They are actually stories as well.
Yeah,
they are narratives in not even a sentence.
Yeah,
so that's actually kind of amazing how good. And when normal people have no narrative versus narrative, they almost always will go to, even if, I'm sure a lot of people didn't really think, oh, we're going to get 350 million a week to the NHS anymore. But they liked it. So well, at least he's got a message.
Yeah, it was something straightforward that they could understand. Even if it ended up not being the case, it was something they could read on the side of a bus, literally. And that was more than they would probably get in any other way. Maybe it was something that they could understand.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think that to me, and that, I mean, I think it's part of what, in terms of what I do, in terms of, why I speak to people, why is TED popular? Right?
Yeah.
Think about it. Why? I mean, it's literally a lecture series, right? I mean, we've had lectures for almost as long as people have been able to communicate.
Yeah.
Right? Because you don't need the internet. You don't need the 1,500 person audience. You can have two, and that's you can give a keynote to an audience of two, if you will. And obviously, you've had great institutions like the BBC and others who have recorded stuff and made it available on a broadcast basis, right? And I think what TED have really done well is they have been able to bring storytelling techniques, even if it's the most basic 3-part story structured technique, to communicating oftentimes very challenging and complex topics, whether it be in sciences, economics, technology, so on and so forth, making those things previously seemingly out of the reach of mere mortals, as somebody's like, oh, okay, I get it now. It's one of the most common expressions that people want to have after listening to a decent TED talk about something, and I think that's it. To me, again, it just speaks to, if we could master how to communicate. And then I think some of the problem that we have, and you will see this with technologists oftentimes, is when their product doesn't succeed, right? They will often blame the customer, saying, well, those idiots didn't get it. That's the problem. So that, the problem is our customer's too dumb, and we've got to figure out how to educate them, right?
Yeah.
And that's, unfortunately, I guess a curse of being on the left is that you are so in love with the morality of what you're trying to do that it buys you a certain level of moral license, where, like, so whatever you're going to do, bread to everyone, whatever, and then when people reject that message for whatever reason, you get angry at the person and wondering, how could they not see the beautiful moral superiority of the things that we're advocating here, right? And I just think it's like, well, you've just done half the job. It's just like building a product and going, well, fuck the marketing. Excuse my language here, but this is like, that's just bullshit PR. It will sell itself, right?
Yeah.
And as we all know, that's just part of the job, right? And then if you leave it to the other guys who are selling the snake oil, but they're brilliant at marketing, then what happens? What actually happens is that people do then buy the snake oil. They take the snake oil and go, oh my God, it killed my daughter. That's too extreme. But you get my point, is that it doesn't work, and it actually destroys trust in the whole category. In my experience, the problem is that, because I'm a Princeton University undergrad. I got my MBA from the Wharton School of Business in Philadelphia, two supposedly premier training camps for the leaders, and they're not. They're managerial camps, is what they are, right? They're great at logic and critical thinking and analysis and all the tools of the manager. Yeah. And I don't want to turn this into a whole anti-manager thing. Both are important. Great managers and great leaders working together, they can really go far together really, really quickly. And you have seen that on occasion, sort of thing. But the problem is that, someone like a Gordon Brown in this country is a great example, in my opinion, taking it to the political, where he must have been one of the most powerful men in British politics, maybe not in history because I don't know that far back, but certainly in modern politics, in terms of his total command of via the Treasury, of course.
Yeah.
But his ego just had, I have to get the top job. I promised myself, what in my mind is I have to be called PM.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And the moment he took that job, it was a disaster. And it wasn't because all the Blairites, whoever, were like sabotaging him and things. I'm sure they weren't supporting him that much, but it was, and I think that was, to me, a great example of a manager not knowing that they're great at managing machine, but they need someone else to do the politicking, doing the free range stuff of convincing people that we're headed the right way and being able to connect with people at an emotional level and building trust and all those other good things. And I think, so if you're a manager wanting to be a leader, then you actually need to learn the tools of leadership. It's not something that like people are just born with. I mean, I know that supposedly I'm sure there are a tiny percentage of people who are born leaders, right? But I think a lot of other people become leaders. I mean, you see this with entrepreneurs all the time. People who, they may not have started as a great leader, but by surviving the journey of entrepreneurship, they oftentimes become much better. They become better at communicating. They become better at connecting to, whether it be customers or employees or partners or whoever. They realize how much the value, their integrity, and that people can trust their word is such an important, part of achieving anything, right? Especially as a leader, if you will, right?
Yeah.
And so on and so forth. And so I genuinely think, and also, this is just being an entrepreneur means that, you have to take some level of genuine risk, right? Both, whether it be financially or to your reputation, because you're starting up this company, this cafe, this whatever, and you could fail, and everyone's going to know, oh, little Peter failed at this thing, right? And going through that baptism of fire, I think, is a really important thing, because again, most leaders, people who are called leaders, who are actually managers, they just go through the track of, they're typically born in a good family that are generally relatively wealthy. They then go to a decent school. They then go to a decent university. They then get onto some sort of good, fast tracking leadership thing, and so on and so forth. And never once do they actually ever face any genuine, real risk to themselves. You know? They're never put through it. They call hardship, I had to stay up late,
exactly,
doing exams or papers or whatever sort of thing, like, come on, And so, anyways, so that's to me one of the key things I think that we're lacking in our world, just generally. Certainly, the wealthier the country, the more this is true, is actual leadership anymore.
Yeah.
And I think, again, if you look at companies, if you look at Google today, right? I mean, in the earliest days before anyone knew what Google was, right? They all they had was basic. I mean, they had a bit of technology, but they mostly had a start. And of course, most startups don't even have a bit of technology like Google. All they have is an idea.
Yeah.
Right. And so, in order for that idea to attract attention, they have to wrap a good narrative and story around it, right?
Yeah.
As part of it, to attract investment, to attract, but then let's eventually say they get rich, which obviously Google has done pretty well on that score, I think, right? And the Google today and the Google of, back in the, say, whatever you want to pick, 2010, 15, 20, It's a lot different, and it's because it's become largely led by management. You know?
Okay, so for some more inspiration, so that's the kind of things that happen with the sort of talks that you do and the presentations at Thinking Digital and TEDx. You've also got a photograph that inspires you. Can you show us that?
Yes, I cheated and I brought two, so I hope that's okay.
Brilliant. Yes, of
Okay,
course.
I won't go on too far, but these are two fish. I'll start with this one here. It's a little bit perhaps more obvious. Should I show it to the camera?
Yes, of
Okay,
course.
cool.
Yeah.
So hopefully you can see it. Is that and what this is? It's a picture of the audience at Thinking Digital, and I realize this seems horribly self-promotional, and it's not meant to be that.
No.
What the reason that I brought it and the reason it inspires me, and there are of course other photos we have of it, is I mean when I came to the Northeast, you know, my my big idea. I mean, ultimately I was inspired. Sorry to make this all about Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, but
Yeah.
they met at a homebrew computing club, you know, networking event
Yeah.
in Silicon Valley. And that's how they literally met. And, you know, and of course there are many other stories. There's a whole economic theory about, you know, about the value of clustering, but, you know, by some very smart people at MIT and other places like that. And that, I mean, well, I might as well, for the purpose of this photo, go into it just really quickly, which is just, they did, it was actually a joint study between Cambridge and MIT looking at this so-called thing called clusters, and you'll sometimes hear about economic clusters, and that this is, you know, they're super valuable. And they were kind of like, okay, so what is it about these clusters that makes it? And so what they did is they compared the greater Boston area to the United Kingdom and a region of Germany, right? So three different countries. And the reason they compare those three things is because they all received, roughly speaking, a similar level of federal and private research and development money. But you won't be surprised to hear that Greater Boston greatly outshone them all. So, I mean, one of the things that I learned about in this journey was around something called cluster theory, which is a formal economic thing that people talk about. And, you know, it's more than, I mean, to some extent, it's kind of self-explanatory that, oh, clusters of people get together and they do cool stuff, right? But it goes a bit further than that. And I actually learned of research done formally between Cambridge and MIT in the United States, looking formally at clusters. And what they did was they compared three areas of the world: the Greater Boston area, a region in Germany, and the UK as a country.
Yeah.
And they did that because all three received roughly the same amount of research and development money between federal sources and private sources. But Greater Boston as a unit just did far better economically, their ability to convert that into. And so they were kind of looking around, you know, and so, you know, they had the normal sort of usual explanations about the, you know, Americans are just generally more risk taking. You know, culturally they aren't ashamed of failing and all that sort of stuff, right? And of course, there may well be something there, right, sort of thing. But I think what they discovered was, you know, through extensive interviews and research, was that one of the big things about Boston was that because it was a smaller geographic unit, where obviously the chance of getting to know someone was easier because you were literally in the same sort of space, right? That there is perhaps a sense amongst the people there that networking is part of your job, whether that's for the company or just for your own personal career.
Yes.
And so the big thing was ultimately this is, and I'm sure you've been in situations like this where, you know, someone comes in and presents something. Maybe they're trying to sell you something. It could be a job interview, whatever it might be, right? And you go, well, it sounds pretty cool, but, you know, like, how do I know? Because obviously you've sat there all formally, they've presented their best face, and now you're trying to really find out what's really happening here, right? And the thing about Greater Boston is the ability for someone to privately, discreetly, you know, confidentially pick up the phone or drop an email or have a quick coffee and say, God, I met this Peter Bull guy and he seems really good. You know, we want to invest $5 million, but, you know, what, do you know anything?
Okay.
And of course, more often than not, they will. And they, you know, and they'll say, you know, if anything, put in 50 million with Peter, because he's underselling himself. I guarantee you that, right? You know, there's a lot more there, and he's got so much potential. Or, of course, the opposite, which is that guy is brilliant, but he is so difficult to work with, right? And he will not,
Hopefully not.
you know, and so he should stay in research. He should stay in academic setting. You should pair him up with someone that's commercially patient enough to, you know, tease out some of that value and then put it into a commercial. So these kinds of basically, you know, the actual genuine honest chats.
Yeah.
But if you don't already have a pre-made social connection with these people,
Right.
because you haven't met them at conferences, you haven't met them at whatever it might be, it's much harder to do.
Yeah, so that's what makes the difference. It's sort of speaking to someone else that you trust about someone else you don't know yet. That then helps build trust with that new person. So is that the kind of thing where thinking digital can kind of foster that kind of connections? Is that why that's inspires you?
Well, that's a big part of, you know, what we try to do, you know, with our events, is try to create that, what we call pop-up community. Right?
Yeah.
And I've had so many anecdotal things about people who met other people there, and at the very least, I mean, in some cases they've had babies and got married.
Oh, wow.
In some cases, obviously, a lot of friendships extended over time. So there is a well-known Stanford-based psychologist named Carol Dweck,
Yeah.
who wrote a book probably now 20 years ago called Mindset. And if you've ever heard the phrase a growth mindset or a closed mindset or a fixed mindset, those all kind of basically come off of the back of that work. Right. And what she argues is that, you know, people that retain a learning or a growth mindset. So the idea being is, you know, when we're children, right, and we're food is flying all over our faces, we're falling over, you try to get on bikes and follow, and you're just doing stuff because it's curious, it's interesting, you're learning, right?
Yeah.
And you don't know to care about what people might think, because, you know, you shit on the sofa. Right? You're just doing it. I mean, and what she talks about is that at some point people learn that they have like an identity relative to other people. They suddenly, at some point, you start to, for some people, and it's a spectrum.
Yeah.
You know, some people very early on become very aware. They become very status conscious, right?
Right.
They say, you know, without naming names, obviously, you know, so they start dressing better. That, you know, they, and you know, and so and then actually for bright kids, oftentimes it's a problem, because you might show some aptitude in math.
Yeah.
You know, and you become, it's Peter the math wizard.
Right.
You know, you're the math genius, right? And here's the thing about it, right? Which is cool, right? I mean, you think I'm complimenting this kid, and, you know, things, and I'm not lying. You know, Jenny, you now have a reputation to defend, right? You're now at 12, and suddenly you have a reputation. And so one of the weird things about that is that you actually start to potentially shy away from challenges, because you don't want to lose the reputation as the math genius, right?
Of course, yeah.
You don't want to actually be with other kids who might be actually bigger math geniuses than you are, right? You know, and of course, you know, there are of course plenty of people who, you know, in that space, who don't worry about that. And you'll know some of these people who they love learning so much that actually they want to meet even brighter geniuses, right? Because they know there's like, and then just that. And so, you know, her argument is just that people that can retain that spirit of learning, and so, no, without being foolhardy, she's not, you know, expecting people to just, you know, remain all wide-eyed and in you know, in love with learning, but, you know, and then these are the characteristics. And she said, you know, as she specialized in child development, those people are the ones who, you know, in general go off to be certainly happier, you know, generally speaking, more successful, both in professional life as well as personal life. You know, so on and so forth, right? So, which all good, right? That sounds good. And you think, okay, I want to have a learning mindset. Let's do this, right? But then you go, okay, so what she doesn't give you is, so how do you actually get there?
Yeah, what does that mean?
You know, how do you actually, you know, for a moment and so I'm not arguing in any way that what we do is the only way to do it, but I do think that it is something that brings people from all different walks of life back into a learning mindset, for at least an afternoon. And that in itself is a joyful state, right? There is something inherently joyful about just learning something interesting you didn't know before. Finding inspiration has got to include some element of development and of change, whatever that looks like, to you. I've found inspiration, obviously, I'd say in travel, in movies that I've seen that have had, in impact on, perspective and values, books, obviously for me, conferences and gatherings. But I think it's just actively thinking about what that is for you, and it'll change because sometimes,
exactly.
Books, if you're a book person, maybe to some extent you have to take a vacation from books.
And do something different.
And do something different. Go see a movie. Invest in seeing, old friends that you haven't seen before, or in a while, and so it's and I mean, to be honest, that is, I think that is actually, particularly for creatively minded people, is actually a challenge. Is how do you find your inspiration? Because it was easy. We would just go, oh, well, I need to do my inspiration exercises today.
Just do it. Exactly.
And so for me, so it's been, I think I've talked about the ice bath. Another thing that I've invested in has been in meditation. That, and I do genuinely believe that it's made a real difference in that. I think we're taught to believe that somehow or another your emotional responses to something are just pre-coded things. Someone says, fuck you, asshole, and I have to get angry at this person, and then maybe say fuck you back, or maybe punch them, or whatever it might be, right? You could actually choose to not even get angry about it, and make a choice to do that.
Change your response.
There will be initial emotional responses. I'm not saying, you can pre-code that out of your life, but you don't have to, especially if you know it's to your detriment. Someone says something offensive and you punch them, well, that has consequences. You might be morally correct, and everyone around you saying that's
but it's going to be a lot worse for you because of that, though.
I'm walking to a hotel in the Docklands area, and with my bags, and there's like a group of, say, 12 kids, and let's say like average age 14 or something like that, right? And then one of them jumps out at me, right? And basically to scare me and who press his group sort of thing, right? And I just literally I was trying to act tough. I was trying to act cool. I had no idea it was a surprise, but it was just like, oh, hello. I literally said, oh, hello, as if he was a little child, which he was, and just moved on, and so I don't know what else to credit to other than this idea that maybe this meditation stuff actually does work, and that, and the only thing I would say is that I think that it's very useful for what you might call acute stress situations, where something bad has happened and you need to actually stay cool in real time, right? Well, I think it can possibly be bad is to try and manage it in chronic stress situations where you have a chronic stress in your life and you choose to kind of mute the emotionality of it through your meditative techniques. Which means you're effectively ignoring stress that actually is in your life. And so it's kind of like you can over-index, having found this, like, it's like anything, the hammer always, to a hammer, everything is a nail.
Exactly.
And so that's what I'd say is the only thing to do is just like, it's cool if you've actually have found some value out of meditation, but it's not the answer of all things.
No.
It's just useful in certain situations. So.
Something that's worked for you. And that's the thing, is like you're finding that change, that thing that means you can deal with the situation much better. I mean, those are the situations you're able to deal much better. And there could have been much more negative consequences to those, but just having that mindset, having that sort of base, whatever it might be, to kind of be more resilient in a situation, I guess was quite useful in your case.
So for me, I think, those basically trying stuff, is been a real source of inspiration. And I feel, unfortunately, I can't speak to Herb in a parallel universe who never did meditation, who doesn't do ice baths, and ask him how he's going. But it feels like, knowing who I was before and who I am now, that like it has made a difference, and I think that's that's because, and that's, I think for me, that one of the biggest differences is not just going, oh, I need inspiration. It's time for us to go on our annual holiday,
Yeah.
whatever, right? Or got to go to this conference again, you know.
Yeah.
And it's like anything, it's like it's like having too much champagne. We were talking about that before, where it's like you drink champagne every day, and guess what? It's no longer special.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you find value or pleasure out of something once, doesn't mean you need to go to the same trough every single time.
Yeah.
And so, I think honestly, for a lot of people who suffer from mental illness, I think sometimes it's a case of they can't find inspiration to move on, and maybe it's because their searching for inspiration is broken. They're using the same old things,
the same tools to expect a different outcome, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like people who lots of people party and have a great time in their 20s and 30s, and sometimes they carry on in the 40s and 50s, and it becomes a problem.
Yeah,
they've always not moved on in developing what is a good time look like at this phase in my life. So yeah,
brilliant, excellent. Thank you very much. Great. So that was great to have you on this episode of Talking Inspiration. So if you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe to Talking Inspiration and catch your next dose of inspiration.
Niltoni Broadcast Network, NBN. Popcorn for your ears.